Thank you all so much for coming to our presentation today, from automation to insights, how we can boost Salesforce quality with Provar's unified platform. So this will be primarily demo focused. We don't have a lot of slides to go along with this, and that's really because we just kind of will show you what we've been working on here at Provar. So we'll be showing you some of the newest, latest and greatest product updates from our two core products, Provar Quality Hub, previously known as Provar Manager, and Provar Automation. Be showing you some updates from there as well, and just giving you an overview of the platform and what you can do with Provar. So for those of you that don't know, I don't have any introduction slides to go along with it today. We're just going to jump right into it. But my name is Michael Dailey. I'm a PBU director here at Provar. My primary role is overseeing our Salesforce app on the App Exchange, Provar Quality Hub, and our grid platform for test execution in the cloud as well. So let's go ahead and jump into it today. And really what we're going to be doing is just trying to answer these key questions here. So this is my only slide just to kind of set the conversation of what we're going to be talking about today and what we're going to be showing you through the demo. So these are the key questions that we're going to be addressing. So the first one is, how do we test complex systems at scale? This is kind of the underlying problem behind testing and the need for test automation, is how do we test these systems like Salesforce, like SAP, Oracle, NetSuite, Workday, etc., anything involving different API endpoints and whatnot. How do we test these at a scalable rate, and how do we make sure that everyone on the team is enabled to do so? So this is one of the questions that we'll be addressing through our demo today. The second one is, how do we incorporate testing into DevOps processes? So one of the biggest drawbacks to doing manual testing is that you can't, of course, incorporate a manual process into a CI/CD or an automated process that you have with DevOps. So you need to utilize test automation for that. But then the question then becomes, how do we incorporate what we're doing from the test automation side to the rest of our DevOps process? They tend to be very disjointed. So that's a key question that we want to answer today, is how we can include test automation as part of that overall picture. The third one is, how do we maintain our tests? So once we have our test cases created and once we have them running in a pipeline, how do we make sure that we're maintaining them over time, and how do we limit the maintenance that's required for those test cases going forward? So this is going to be an ongoing issue for a lot of people that are doing test automation using general frameworks, especially on the Salesforce platform. You'll find that there's a lot of test maintenance associated with those. We've covered those problems in other webinars and other presentations, and we have other materials available on our website that kind of outline this problem statement here of the problem of maintaining test cases inside of Salesforce and other complex systems. So I won't go into too much detail on that, but just know that'll be part of the demo as well. And then, so the fourth thing here is, how do we see the results of our test cases? So once we have everything working, we've incorporated it into our processes, we're maintaining our test cases. How do we know what the results of our test cases are? Where do those reports live? Where do the defects live? Where do we do our defect management, our defect tracking? How do we circle that back into the developers, the admins, to get those changes fixed and implemented? So the results of your tests are just as important as the actual test cases themselves, because otherwise you can't see the results and you don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. And then the last one here is, how do we let the business know the state of our testing and maturity? This is more of a recent question that we've been asking as we've been talking to some of our customers and prospects, is, what's your current quality maturity? Where are you sitting at in terms of your overall maturity across your entire quality lifecycle for all of your products, not just for Salesforce apps, but for other apps as well? So this is a hard question for a lot of people to answer, because it requires a lot of different teams communicating, requires a lot of metrics that you need to consolidate. So this is a question that we're going to be asking and hopefully addressing as well as part of our demo today. So that kind of sets the scene for us. So that's really my only slide today. I'm going to jump straight into a demo, and we're going to start by showing you what we've been working on from Provar Quality Hub. So for those of you that have seen Provar Manager before, Provar Manager is our Salesforce app on the App Exchange. We've recently rebranded it or renamed it to Provar Quality Hub. And the reasoning for that is we really want to realign with what our vision is for the product and what we want to do with it for our core product, Provar Automation, but also just for the wider market. And part of this is addressing some of those questions that we just asked previously. So how do we see the results of our testing? How do we know what our current quality maturity is? So this Quality Hub dashboard is really meant to answer a lot of those questions that we may be asking, or the business may be asking the testing team. They want to know what the results of the latest test run are. They want to know, how many manual hours are we actually saving through automation? What's our actual pass rate overall? What are we getting out of this product that we're paying into in terms of ROI? How do we measure all of that? So having to do that manually is quite labor intensive, of course, because you don't necessarily have the metrics that you need. But luckily, within our product, we have all those metrics through our reporting capabilities and through everything that we have built into the app architecturally behind the scenes. So we're able to construct what we call our executive view of our Quality Hub dashboard. This executive view shows you an overall quality maturity. So out of 5 stars, what's your maturity rating and what's your percentage of your overall goals that you've defined? Now, the benefit in doing it this way is that all these metrics are actually driven by separate KPIs that we can define behind the scenes. So, for example, for test execution success rate, if our target is 90%, for example, so if we scroll over this one, our target is actually 95% for this particular metric. So if we want to reach that metric, we need to increase our test execution success rate by, X number of percent to get there. So this kind of shows you your overall tier that you sit within that particular metric. Each of these has their own tiers that we've defined, and we can set goals for our organization to reach. So you can change these over time as well, and we can see by different date ranges where we're kind of trending for each of these. And the benefit also is that we can drill down into each of these ranges here and see a trend over time. So we can see what our total success rate is over time for our metrics, and we can see at those different data points. We can see the total number of test cases that have passed or failed and the average duration of those test cases. We'll also get Provar recommended tips based on the data that we have in the org. For example, here, this is recommending for this particular use case that I use API set up and tear down test cases where possible to limit the fragility of UI tests in general. So that's just one tip that we'll get there for this particular insight. We'll see again what our current maturity is, what we need to get to the next tier and things like that, as well as ways that we can improve, just tips that we can improve our particular test execution success rate. So we'll have all these metrics here. Now, quality and efficiency is just one kind of value driver that we have for this particular dashboard. We'll also have additional value drivers such as accelerated time to market. This will basically take into consideration 2 different things: our release duration, average release duration, and our test cycle time reduction. Average release duration basically is going to measure the number of releases that you've put out and what the average time is between those releases. So we can look at this particular drill down chart here, and we can see for each of our releases how much time it's taken for each of those. And we can see this one was 4.3 weeks, 2.1, etc. So we kind of have a trend going downwards here, which is great. So we've actually shown an improvement there for our particular release duration times. And we can see our goal is 74% for this particular metric. So we're basically targeting, a certain threshold there for how we want to reduce our time to market for our releases overall. And we can also relate this to our test cycle times. So we can see what's our average duration for all of our testing and what's the average reduction for those test cycles over time. So we can see our current cycle time is about 16.2 hours, and it started at about 89.3 6 months ago. So we've improved that by 82% for this particular date range, which is really good in this particular metric. So we're at a tier 4. We have additional ones down here. One of the ones that's quite interesting is we can actually track how much team capacity we freed up through automation. So one of the kind of main value adds for automation in general is that ideally you shouldn't need as many team members if you're doing things through an automated fashion. Now, we're not trying to replace any FTEs or full-time employees or anything like that. This is just to kind of show, again, the value of the product that you're getting out of it. So if you have a single automation engineer, they can do the work of several manual QAs that are doing the same thing over and over again through regression testing. Because once they've automated a regression suite, you don't have to execute it manually every time. So you can save some team capacity there, which frees you up to do additional testing, such as exploratory testing and in-sprint testing and things like that. And then down here at the bottom, we have a couple of different metrics. We can track our overall ROI for Provar. We can see what we're getting out of the product based on the number of executions, the automation, the labor savings, the risk avoidance, which is something that we can define in the app as well. So we can define certain risks, certain impacts that those risks might have. And then if they result in a defect and we resolve those risks, then we can actually add that into our risk avoidance calculator here. So we can define, as I mentioned, different date ranges. So if we go into our 12-month range, we'll get additional data here, and we can see what the results of that time range are as well. But this is again, our executive view of our dashboard. We're also going to be releasing a QA coverage overview. So this would be more for the QA leaders, the test automation engineers, who are more curious what their coverage is like across their apps, their orgs, their different operating systems or platforms, or specific areas of the business that they may be wanting to segregate and look at coverage metrics from their metadata coverage, their the LWC coverage for all their Lightning Web components, and different things like that. So that is going to be in the next version of the Quality Hub dashboard. But for now, we have the executive view here, which is currently available on the App Exchange. Now, as I mentioned, all these are configurable. So if we go into our Quality Hub configuration, we can configure different things like what our actual Provar annual license cost is, what our cost is for our grid licenses, how many licenses we have, and other things like, average cost of a defect, etc. So all these are configurable that drive our time cost models. And then we'll also have our different KPIs and thresholds that we can define as well. So we can see for automation coverage what our thresholds are, and we can change those, which would overall change our quality maturity for our org. And as I said, these can all be edited and they can be increased or decreased over time depending on our use case. Now that's kind of an overview of the Quality Hub dashboard. This is the newest, the latest and greatest for Provar Manager, aka Provar Quality Hub. But I'll show you something as well in our previous release, which may have not seen a lot of usage. So what we can see here is one of our latest AI capabilities that we've enhanced for test case generation inside of Provar Quality Hub. So test case generation is a very hot topic these days from an AI perspective. People want to know how you handle natural language processing and using a Jira or some kind of user story to import and then convert that or generate a test case from that input. So we have this capability in the product today to be able to generate tests using natural language input or a description for your test scenario, as well as input from a Jira issue that we may have created. So we can link this to a particular Jira issue that we've imported in from Jira. We sync those automatically once you set up that connection to Jira to Quality Hub. And then once those issues are synced, they're bidirectionally synced between the two apps. So we can create those test cases and those will be linked as well on the Jira side. So we can go ahead and just define a basic one here. So we'll just say create and convert a lead, for example. And we can define our description. Say we want to test the ability to create a new lead and convert it to an account. And so right now our scenario strength is strong, so we can even offer to improve this scenario description, again, using our AI behind the scenes. So it'll take into context a couple of different things to improve that scenario description, such as the objects and the field definitions, to try to be as precise as it possibly can. So it gives me a more verbose definition here. I can accept that suggestion, and we can see what that looks like. So it's got some preconditions, it's got a description, it's got the test steps laid out for me. So it's already got a really good definition of how I would create a test case. So now I can move forward from here and add additional context. Now, one of the things that we do differently with our test case generation is rather than just sending off a natural language input with some prompt engineering, we also take into context your Salesforce org and your metadata that you're testing against. So for example, here, if I have an account object, which I can search for here, right here, I can add this as a selected context object, and I can also look for my lead and add that as well. Now, what that allows me to do is if I have any custom fields, custom objects, I can add all those as context to the generation, which will allow it to be aware of the org that it's testing on. So rather than just using generic names or generic field names that may or may not exist, you get a lot of hallucinations if you were to do this generically using ChatGPT or Gemini or something like that. So we take all of that into context, we pass it over to the LLM, and that allows us to do what we call context-aware test case generation. And then we can define different things like our persona. So let's just say we're a sales user. If I can find the sales user here, sales representative. And then we can define different output types. So the output types that we currently support are text, XML, JSON, Markdown, Java, and Apex for actual generating unit tests and Java Selenium tests. And then Gherkin tests as well if we want to do that. So we can actually specify here. So right now we'll just go ahead and select JSON to get a nice JSON output there. And then we can specify the number of tests up to 25 at once for this particular prompt. So now once we hit generate, it's going to pass all that information in securely over and it'll give us a test case back into the environment. We can optionally save all the test cases that it has generated, and we can take a look at those. All right, so we can scroll down here and take a look at those test cases. So we see we have 3 tests that it has generated, and we can look at each of those with their test steps. They'll have their expected results, their test data that they may need. And you can see here it's using relevant information. It's not, and it also is going to use any custom fields, like I mentioned, that we have for those objects that we've attached here. So let's go ahead and just save all these test cases. We could optionally download these locally as well if we want to document them somewhere else, or if we just want to export them to another test management solution. So once those are saved, they're actually created inside of Provar Quality Hub, and they can be synced back into Provar Automation as well. So we can use this as a template or starting point for our actual automated test cases. And if we're just doing manual testing, we can actually, use this as a manual test case generator and then document all of our test cases directly inside of Salesforce here, as well as our executions. So all these test cases that get created, we can create manual test executions for and then log them directly inside of Quality Hub. In the future, we'll also be, in the very near future, something that we're working on right now is to add the capability for test case generation to generate Provar test cases, which will be directly executable in our automation platform. So that's soon to come in the near future, something that we're currently working on right now. So that's what we currently have through the AI inside of Provar Quality Hub. That's as part of the newer features that we've just released in the previous version. This is already available as well. If you have access to Provar Manager, Provar Quality Hub, then you'll have access to this once you configure your API key to interact with OpenAI. So that's pretty much all I wanted to show from the Quality Hub side of things. I want to switch over to automation, and then we'll come back here when we talk about the actual test results and what those look like. So let me switch over into automation really quickly. Okay, so for those of you who have seen Provar Automation, we have 2 primary versions, and this is our newer version of Provar Automation. We call it V3. So V3 is our new modernized UI for Provar Automation. It's also simplified, and we've grouped things in a very logical manner so that it's easier to navigate within the app, and we've improved a lot of the performance behind the scenes of our metadata interactions, so that way it can be more scalable for larger org bases. Okay, so for Provar Automation, the first thing that you're typically doing when you're doing testing, as I mentioned, how do we handle these complex systems and how do we handle them at scale? So the first thing that we're going to be doing is setting up all of our connections to our different systems that we may be wanting to test. Now from there, when we're creating those connections, we have a specific type for Salesforce, for generic web services, for generic websites, of course, for our database interactions, email server interactions as well. If we want to validate or read from an email server, we can do that within Provar Automation. Whenever we're creating these Salesforce connections, typically we can use username and password. You can also configure these through OAuth, but something that allows us to scale this out very easily is our native support for Salesforce metadata in terms of handling users and connections. So we have what we call test environments. Once we define these test environments, it allows us to override each of our connections that we create. So for example, if we create an admin user here, and we create a dev test environment, we can create a test environment override for dev to log into the dev environment. So that allows us to quickly switch between each environment down here inside of the runtime settings for Provar Automation. But once we get into a CI/CD situation, or we're executing this through the CLI in a remote server or in the cloud or in Provar Grid, then we can actually parameterize these test environments and pass them in. So that allows us to configure which tests are running on which org. Now, all that is to say, the tests that you create in Provar are meant to be what we call org agnostic. So when you create these environment overrides, you can run your test across all your orgs without having to manage or maintain different versions of them depending on what org you're testing, which is a big value add when it comes to scalability, because you don't want to have different code bases or different test suites that correspond to different orgs or different users, etc. So we make that very easy to manage and maintain from that perspective. We also have the capability to do what we call login as via an admin connection. So this allows me to specify like a different user, like a sales user here, and then I can use that admin connection that I've created and then specify whatever the username is for that particular user in the org. And that'll allow us to not have to configure the credentials for all the users that we're trying to do persona-based testing for. So it makes it very easy to manage and maintain. And we can additionally create overrides for these as well. So you see, there's a lot of things that we do just with the connections. But once we have those connections, that really opens up the gateway for all the capabilities that we have to interact with Salesforce inside of Provar Automation. Because we're Salesforce centric, but not Salesforce only, we have those capabilities, but we can also interact with any other web service, any other generic website from an automation perspective as well. So if we go into our Explorer tab here, this is kind of similar to the org browser. If you've ever seen or used the org browser in the older version of Eclipse, or if you ever utilized the developer console or anything like that from Salesforce, you'll be familiar with kind of how this looks here. Basically, we can see a breakdown by each of the connections and each of the objects within those connections that have been pulled from the orgs. And if we click on one, we can see a snapshot of some of the data for that particular object, those records in the org. Not super important to be able to interact with the data or anything like that, but this does allow us to then drag and drop each one of these into a test case to interact with it through Sockwell. So for example, if we want to read a specific account, or if we want to create or delete or update one, we just need to highlight the account here and go into our tests and find which test case we want to drag and drop that into. So we can drop that into this test case here, and then it'll prompt us to add a Sockwell query step. The reason I'm highlighting this is because interacting with Salesforce, a lot of the times you can do most of your testing through the backend, through these Sockwell queries and API calls. So it makes testing very scalable, reliable, but it also makes it very repeatable in the sense that we can do the same thing over and over again. We don't have to rely on the fragility of the UI, or if we're just doing data creation, we don't necessarily need to do data creation directly in the UI and the user interface in Salesforce. We can do it in the backend, and we can run all of our validations in the UI manually using our functional testing. So that's just one way that we can do that. Now, whenever you add these steps in here, we can do a custom Sockwell query, create, read, update, and delete. But also, if you're doing persona or profile testing, one of the more important features that we have through our Salesforce integration is this ability to extract and assert page layouts for objects. Now, this will do the entire object layout for a particular object across all of your profiles and permission sets. Now, this is something that's very, very difficult to do manually, and it can be very tedious. So if you have a developer or an admin making changes to an object or to a field, or adding a new field, and you want to validate all the permissions for a particular object at scale across all of your permission sets and profiles, it can be very tedious to do that. There are certain tools available, such as Data Loader and things like that, to be able to retrieve all that, but being able to actually do the comparison is something that we do through these two-step process here. So we can do an extraction at one point, you have a deployment that takes place, and then you run your validation or your assertion against that extraction of the particular layout. So we can do this, and this allows us to basically do profile and permission-based testing through the APIs in a matter of seconds versus having to do it hours or even sometimes days if you're doing it manually. Now, let me jump into an actual scenario here, show you how Provar Automation works. If you've never seen Test Builder, this is kind of really where we get into the test authoring piece. So let me jump into it. Once we have that test connection created for Salesforce, we validated the metadata has been loaded and everything, we can jump straight into a scenario where we can begin adding a new test case. So I'll say create property flow. All right, and then I'm going to specify a folder. I'm just going to put this in the Dreamhouse folder for now. And of course, we just want to do a normal test case, and we can use our existing connection for our admin. And then we can specify our Salesforce application. Now, this is pulling from the metadata for that admin connection. So it'll pull all the apps that this user would have access to through the app launcher that allows us to do it here. So rather than having to automate logging in and going into the app launcher, searching for the app we want to go to and clicking it, we can do all that within a single Salesforce Connect step here. So let me find the Dreamhouse app, Lightning here, and I'll click Finish. Now what's going to happen is it's going to load on the right-hand side of my screen the Test Builder application, which is where we're going to see the test actually executing. We're also going to see where we can debug the test. We can step to different points in the test case. We can jump backwards. We can pause. We can abort the test run and other actions as well. And then the left-hand side, this is going to load in our browser here, which is going to take care of a number of different things for us. It's going to handle that login. It's going to also take us to the Dreamhouse app. and it's going to make sure the page is loaded before we continue. Okay, so now we're at kind of the starting point for our test. So I've named this test case create property flow because I'm going to be creating a property using this screen flow here. Now, usually when we show off Test Builder and we're talking about Provar Automation, a lot of times we're just creating basic records such as an account, a lead, an opportunity, etc. But I wanted to show you all how we handle screen flow specifically because it's a little bit different and I wanted to highlight our capabilities there. So let me go ahead and right click on the property name here and click add to test case. And that's going to load in what we call a web component. So if you're using a ScreenFlow or Lightning Web Components as part of your Salesforce org and your implementation, this is just to show you how we support those. So I've already actually mapped these once. So it's already recognizing them here. I don't need to do anything differently. But it's important to note here, it's using field names, it's using metadata APIs where available for all these fields so that they're still resilient, they're still strong locators. There's nothing that's going to be brittle in this particular flow if we change a label or something like that. All right, so let me go ahead and just set this to our property name. Now I live in Nashville, so I'm going to be using a local arena for my property that I'm going to be creating here. If anyone catches that, please let me know in the chat. So as it's loading, you see the page actually refreshing here in live time. So what's happening is Provar always makes sure that you're on the correct tab, the correct screen, the correct page before it tries to interact with any of the fields on that page. Now, the reason this is very important from a test automation perspective, normally what you'd need to do if you're doing this in Selenium or generic framework is you need to, right click on the Property Explorer tab. You need to make sure that that element's loaded. You have to wait for it to be visible or enabled. All that kind of plays into before you can even ever type into this field here. So there's a lot of things that you need to do. Now, initially, you may not have to do that to get a working scenario in a generic framework like Playwright or Selenium. But if you want your test to be robust and you want it to work in conjunction with other tests, you always want to make sure you're on the correct screen and you never want to assume that. So Provar takes care of that for me here by making sure I'm on the correct tab and the correct screen flow is loaded here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and right click on my broker name here, and I'm going to continue on building out this particular test. I'm going to use an existing broker record. So this is typically I wouldn't recommend relying on existing data when you're doing testing. But for this scenario, it's just a demo, so I can do what I want there. No worries. And now I'm going to add my price here as well. I'm just going to modify this. All right, so now we can go ahead and click our next button and we'll continue on. And you can see as we're kind of building this out, it's very quick. We're able to easily add these fields. All these are recognizable by Test Builder with no issues. And for this one here, this is an address, so it actually has a specific way of handling it. We can add all the fields at once. So we can say 501 Broadway. Our city is Nashville. Our province is Tennessee. Country is United States. Now, for now, I'm typing in all this information manually. In the future, what I would like to do is I would like to parameterize all this or use a data source as an Excel or something like that to pull in all this information so that it's not hard-coded in my test case. And that way I can change the data source and it'll change the way that the test case behaves. But for now, this is okay for the demo scenario. So we're going to continue on. We're going to add or change our number of bedrooms here. Just modifying some fields. So I'll set this to 6. Click add and do. And I'll change my bathrooms here to 6 as well. And I'll click add and do. And I'll click next. Again, this is the same next button, so it's already recognized. We're just continuing on through our screen flow and basically just testing that this screen flow is working properly. Now we can also do a file upload. So I'm just going to go ahead and upload a picture here. If I can remember the name of my file, I believe. Perfect. So the file has been uploaded. So now we can continue on, click next. And we'll verify all of that on the next screen once this property is created. All right, so there we go. So our property is now created, screen flow is completed. Now at the end of the screen flow, there's a step to navigate me to the actual created record. So this is something that I would want to verify. We don't want to assume that. So we want to go ahead and start adding in some validations here. So one of the things that I may want to validate rather than enter in text or set a field or click a button is, for example, the status here. So the status is the default value is available. So let's go ahead and right click that field, and we can see here the interaction type is now read assert. So we can validate a number of different things on any fields in the UI, such as the value itself, the label for that field to make sure it's correct. If there's any validation warnings, we can validate those. That would be through this assertion message or assert message. And then HTML attributes are also important if we're wanting to validate if a field is inline editable, if it's read-only, if it's actually enabled, etc. So we can do all those as additional validation points. But for now, we're just going to make sure that that status is available for that particular property. Now, all of the test steps that we've created so far, we can see how they've been added and passed over here in Test Builder. We can interact with any of these, so we can drag and drop them, move them around. We can right-click them and rename them. So if we want to specify that we're actually validating status here, we can change that name so it's a little bit more clear. And we can change any of the names of these test steps, edit them, delete them, duplicate them, etc. So Test Builder gives you a lot of control for that. But we can also do one of my favorite things here. If you're coming from a Selenium or a Playwright or any kind of generic code-based framework, a lot of times the way that you debug tests is very sequential. It's very back and forth. What you have to do is you go into your editor, your IDE, you make changes to the test, you run the test case, you see where it fails or passes, you see where it gets to, and then you kind of inspect the page, you find the elements that you want to interact with, you go back to the editor and you make changes there, you rerun the test. It's very back and forth, right? So you're doing this kind of this process of seeing what goes wrong and then fixing it, kind of similar to how people are using a lot of LLMs or chats for Chat GPT and things like that. So what we can do with Provar instead is we can right click on any of the step and we can jump to that point in the execution directly. So this allows us to go directly to the point that we're debugging and continue from there. So if we click resume from here, we'll see it's actually going to navigate us back to that screen, and it's going to allow us to continue our execution from that point. So this is a very important feature because when you have a test case that has a lot of steps in it, or if you have a test that has a lot of dependencies and you don't want to run through the entire suite to get to that point of failure, you can easily debug it using that method there. So let me go back to our record that we just created. And we can see the picture here is loaded. We can also validate this image. The couple of different ways that we can do that. We can right click on it here specifically, and we can, maybe assert the attributes for that particular picture, make sure it's enabled. We can assert the value directly to make sure it has the correct image located there. And we can also do the label and different things like that. So there's a lot of different ways that we could validate images directly inside of this particular page. We may also want to validate the broker information because we typed in the broker, but we didn't specify anything else. We want to make sure it's using the correct record. So we can add each of those as validation points for this particular scenario. But that kind of shows you a high level of how Test Builder works, how Provar Automation works with a ScreenFlow in this case, and how it works for Lightning Web Components as well. So from here, like I mentioned, what I would probably do is I would go and I would add additional validations, maybe after the fact, but I would also change these static values to be using a data source. So let me show you how I can do that. So let me go ahead and jump out of this test run here. Right, so this is a test case that I just created. So what I can do, I already have a data source created. I'll show you what that looks like. So this is my data source that I'm using, and it's using all the same values basically that I just typed in manually. So I just need to select the highlighted records here, and then I'll go in and I'm going to essentially add a value or a data source to this test case. So there's a number of different ways that I can do that. I can use the test palette, which gives us access to over 100 different drag and drop commands inside of Provar, such as interacting with data, using conditional logic, doing custom assertions, looping, conditional weights, different things like that. So all of that functionality is contained in the test palette. We can search for what we need to here. And we can also utilize our different AI capabilities from within the test palette as well, such as generating test data, doing our image validation, utterance, and intent validation and generators as well for AI testing. So let me go into our group steps here. I'm just going to add in a group step. And I'm going to say read test data. And I'll change this to a data source. And I'll go ahead and just click this arrow here. And it's going to copy in all of my rows for my data. and that's it. So now I have my data being read into my test. So what I can do, I could go and I can re-execute this again, and I can edit it in Test Builder, but I can also just come and change it directly inside of Provar Automation. So I can change all these values. I use my hotkey to open up what we call Content Assist, where we can use a lot of different functions and preset variables. But we can also access our data source. So we can say property name here for our broker field. We can change this. Broker. We can change our price to also use our variable, and so on and so forth. So I'll just change a couple of those just to kind of show you how that works. But essentially, this allows us to then parameterize our test case. So then when we modify our data source, we can run our test case with different data sets. Now, that's just one way we can do it using an Excel sheet. But we can also create additional rows here. So if we want to duplicate these rows, right, and create different data sets, we can run, all of this and run it into a loop. And then we can basically create multiple property records to make sure that there's nothing happening differently based on how we change record types or pick list values or numbers or anything like that. So this allows us to quickly scale out our testing using Provar and how we interact with data and how we can do looping and things like that. But one of the things I also want to highlight is some of our AI capabilities inside of Provar Automation really quickly. So let me jump into another test here. And I'm just going to say generate test data. And we're not going to launch Test Builder because I'm going to use the test palette to actually add in these steps here. So we actually don't need this connection here. So I'll just delete it. Now I'm going to go into my test palette and I'm going to find the generate test data. I'm going to drag it in here. And I'll select my, I do need my connection. Let me add that connection back in there. There we go. So I have my connection here. So now what I'm going to do is select an object. So basically this is going to allow me to generate using AI a number of different records for a particular object. So for example, if I do a count, I could specify a number of rows here up to, I believe it's 100 or 1,000. I forget the threshold, but let's just do 10. So basically what this allows us to do is it will allow us to select which fields we want to populate, and it will create all those records. Now, it doesn't do it in one shot. It actually creates a data source that we can then use our Apex bulk command from the test palette to generate those records. So let's just go ahead and select type. We can select phone and maybe a description and a rating. So just a couple of fields I'm going to select there, and we'll see that those have been added in here. And we'll do 10 rows. So let me just go ahead and run this in debug. Okay, so once we have that data source created, that then allows us to use our Apex bulk command. So basically what it'll do is it'll create that CSV file, and then we can use that in conjunction with our Apex bulk to generate or create those records. So we can drag in that Apex bulk insert here. We can say account object, and then we can just specify the operation if we're doing an insert or an upsert, if they're existing records. We can do bulk deletions, etc. And then we just specify whatever that data source is where it was created on our machine, and a result job ID here. And it'll run that using Apex bulk, and it'll create all those records once we've verified them through that generate test data. Now, the benefit in doing the generate test data, again, through the Provar operation and not using a third-party solution for this, is that we're not just seeding the org with random data that's not context aware. Again, I'm using that word. So we're actually using the metadata to generate org relevant data for that particular org and all the records that it's creating. So let me show you kind of how this works in action as well inside of a real scenario. So I'm going to say create account, and we're going to jump into our Sales Lightning app really quick here. So now I'm going to highlight the test data generation and our AI test step generation in the same flow to kind of show you how this works. So as that's loading in, because I specified the Sales Lightning app, this is going to take me to a new app in my particular org that I'm logging into. All right, and we're going to go into our new account page directly. So I'll just go into new accounts. All right, now one of the things that we can do, if you're done automation for any point in time, it can be quite tedious if you want to map every single element on a form, such as a new account or something like that, a new custom object. If you have a lot of fields that you're trying to populate manually in the UI, if you can't do it through the backend for whatever reason, if it's part of your requirements to do it in the UI, then one thing we can do is utilizing this AI test step generator. So if we toggle this allows us to select all the fields that we want to populate data for, and then we'll just click add all. So it's going to generate test steps for each of these fields to populate data, but in the background, it's also using that generate test data operation to use org relevant data for all the fields that it's generating test steps for. Now, what I mean by that, so if we have a pick list, it's going to use relevant values for the pick list. It'll use relevant values for any lookup field, such as this parent account, and it'll try to make things as relevant as it can for specific values that are, currency values, phone numbers, emails, etc. So you'll see it do a quick refresh there. Again, it's making sure that I'm on the new account screen before continuing. So I didn't need to map that as an explicit step. I just needed to go directly to the first step that I wanted to add. So we could see it's using all these fields and these values here from our generate test data command. And I'll just kind of step through a couple of those to just show you there. And again, it's going to use relevant data. So it'll actually look up an existing parent account to highlight here and create. So we'll see that get created here. And for this one, we have duplicate values. So it isn't actually able to resolve it. So in this case, we need to specifically select one. So we can just maybe go ahead and change that. All these test steps that are generated through AI are editable. The values can be changed in Test Builder or in Automation and Studio application, and they can be updated, they can be deleted, they can be moved around. So they're fully configurable in that sense. There's no limitation there or anything like that. And it does use, as I mentioned, org relevant metadata. So if you have a specific record type or anything like that, whatever's visible in the UI is not necessarily a limitation. It's really based on what's visible from the metadata side of things. And that's where we're getting all those field information values from. I think my machine has frozen on this step, so I'm going to cancel out of that one and just continue on to the next one here. So let me just jump over since that account already exists. We don't need that one. You will have some scenarios where we have duplicate references, so we need to refine that. But this is really just going to give us part of the way, right? This isn't meant to be like a 100% test flow. Obviously, we would edit this, we would add additional validations, different things like that. One of the things that we can do is those validations inside of our test case. So if we have specific required fields or something like that. So let me go ahead and just delete the account name field, for example. I'll pause it here to show you an example. So if we don't have an account name because it's a required field, we'll see a validation warning here. So one of the things that we typically like to do is call this unhappy path testing, where we're making sure that certain validation warnings appear. Now, normally this would be, this is a basic validation. So maybe this is something that I would add as part of my test case. But if I had a custom validation warning or message that I was surfacing to the user, I want to make sure that that's appearing on the UI. So I can actually validate those messages explicitly. So I'll just go ahead and copy this field here and we'll look for contains and we'll just go ahead and add and do that one. So what that will do is that'll add a new UI assertion to actually validate that that validation warning is appearing for that particular field. So we'll see that. Okay, I think my test builder is paused out for a minute, so hopefully the points communicated for the validation there. I'm not able to add it for right now, so I'm going to continue on to the next stage of that. Sorry for that issue. I am on a newer build, so it could be part of the problem. So you get the idea for automation and how Test Builder works. Hopefully you kind of understand how we use AI in Provar. Really, we're trying to make it as relevant and context aware as we possibly can when we're showing things off in our product. So from there, you may be wondering, okay, where does all this live? So we have all our test cases created locally. We can sync these up into Salesforce, or we can sync them into a Git repository. In this case, I have it linked to my Git repo here, and I also have them added inside of Provar Quality Hub. So these test cases exist there. So once they exist in Provar Quality Hub, I can of course report on them. Let me go ahead and close out of Test Builder here. So once the test cases have been uploaded into Quality Hub and we can report on them, we can see all those metrics that I was showing you in the beginning. So let me go ahead and show you what that looks like here. Go back into my app really quickly, and I'll show you one of my test projects. So once we have those test projects and those test plans created inside of Quality Hub, we'll be able to see all the test suites, all the information here, and we'll be able to see all the executions for those tests as well. So I'm actually going to go into another org where I have some executions that I can show you all. All right, so here we go. So we have a couple of failures here, but we can look at our recent jobs list. This will show us all the jobs that have been ran on Quality Hub for our test automation. So if we take a look at one of these, we can look at this job record here, and that'll pull up all the relevant information for the tests that have run. We'll see the test cycle information. So this would be all of our test executions in that job. We can see the status, the breakdown of all the test executions in that particular cycle. And again, because we are surfacing and reporting all this into Quality Hub, that's what gives us access to that dashboard to be able to show all that information. So if we look at one of these test executions, we'll see the failure here. We can drill down a little bit further and see why it failed. So if we go into the results here, we would get a video playback here. In this case, it wasn't actually able to reach Salesforce because I just updated my security token. So we could see here it's from our screenshot, what we'll see is that it's not able to log in to Salesforce. So we could see why the test case failed directly here. Those screenshots will be automatically attached and uploaded into the org. So we'll see that in the test execution timeline, and we'd see those screenshots in the report, which we can also raise a defect from directly here. So if we think this is a defect for whatever reason, we can attach that to a particular test step by raising it here or to the test execution record. So we can say raise defect, say unable to reach demo environment due to security token change, which may or may not be a bug, but we can set a priority, an impact, etc. And we can also specify if there's a certain environment that we found that in, it'll be linked from the test execution record, which also plays into our Quality Hub dashboard where we're showing things like the defect escape ratio. So if we found a defect in production, then that would play into that escape ratio calculation there as well. So now we can see in our defect tab, we have a defect that has been linked to this particular test execution. If we go and look at that, this is where the Jira integration would come into play, where we may want to link or sync this defect back into Jira to create the bug over there. So we have that bidirectional sync created. It already has the test case and the test execution related automatically from whenever we raised it inside of Provar. And in the future, something that we'll be adding is this root cause analysis for Provar test cases to be able to provide you with an overview, a report of how you may want to get to a root cause and resolve any failures that you may have from your Provar automated test cases. So for now, it is only supported for Apex tests, but we're going to be adding that into the near future for one of our AI capabilities as well. So that's kind of the full picture. That's the full story of our Quality Hub, our unified platform with Provar Automation, and how the two work in tandem. Again, we have those dashboards there, as I was showing you in the beginning. And we also have all of our test cases that have been synced and created inside of automation into Quality Hub where we can report on them. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to go back into our chat and see if we have any questions that have come through. Someone asking about help with a Provar instance for practice purposes. If you're just wanting to kind of get your hands and learn a little bit more about Provar, you can actually go to provar.me and it's free to register. It's our University of Provar platform, similar to Salesforce Trailhead, where you can go and you can get certified. You can learn all there is to know about our products. So that would be my recommendation for anyone who's just curious or wanting to learn more. There was a question, how do you measure coverage? If you're referring to automation coverage, it's a simple calculation that we actually do to measure that. So let me show you back into the app here. Coverage is measured by the number of test cases that we have automated and the number of test cases that we have in total. So that's how we're getting that automation coverage. And we also have an automation coverage date. So it knows, so when we're looking at this trend over time, because we can track those by date, we know how to create that trend. So we can see the number of tests that we have. We have 4,000 Provar tests, this many manual tests. So that's how we calculate that coverage metric. What's the test case generation based on? Is it OpenAI? Yes, for the time being, we are using OpenAI behind the scenes for test case generation. Is it correct to assume that if you used only the API tests and there is no way to verify the click action on UI controls, what would be your recommendation in this regard? If I understand your question correctly, you cannot, of course, verify anything through the API that is only visible or only accessible through the UI. So if you're talking about an interaction or an element type, then that's something that you do need to explicitly do through the UI. We can't do anything like that. API interactions are strictly limited to CRUD-based operations, so creating records, updating them, performing SOQL queries through and reading, updating, and deleting. The data source I created manually beforehand. We can also create that, using other tools. Wasn't too labor intensive for that one. Not a lot of fields. We can create those through exports as well. There was a question, does this version have any enhancement for object field locator logic to minimize page object usage? So we are making consistent updates to our locator technology, both for Salesforce and non-Salesforce applications and for Lightning Web Components and things of that nature. So those will be made and propagated to both of our versions of Provar V2 and V3. However, anything related to AI, which we are going to be incorporating more AI into the product in V3 for self-healing and different things like that, that'll be limited to V3. So anything related to AI will be in V3 exclusively. To get the dashboard to see execution charts, do we need to buy Provar Manager? Yeah, so what you're seeing right here, this is a separate license. We do package these together. That's why we call it our platform rather than listing two products separately. So we can package these, bundle them, Provar Quality Hub / Provar Manager and Provar Automation. But normally they are licensed separately. You can go to the App Exchange and try it out for free. There is a free trial there where you can install it in a sandbox or anything like that. Someone already asked about the recording, so I answered that. There was another question. Does this replace the Quality Center under the Provar Test Manager app? Good question. So no, this is a different app. If you go into the Provar Test Management, Quality Center is still there. So all the same metrics, everything is the same through there. We've made a couple of changes to the theming and different things like that, but otherwise it's the same. If that's it for now, thank you all so much for attending today. Good questions, good engagement. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you learned something. But again, really what we're trying to do is answer those main questions that we kind of addressed in the beginning. So we're looking back at here. Hopefully we're able to answer most of these and you come away with ideas of how you would incorporate Provar into your DevOps, how you would handle complex system testing at scale, how test maintenance works through our metadata and enhanced locator strategy, the results, and then ultimately seeing that quality maturity over time. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.